Hey guys, this is Zach with 8020 Media, here today with a video on the N54 versus N55 BMW engines. So off the bat, these engines share a lot in common. The N54 and N55 both share the same 2,979 cc or 3-liter engine design and are turbocharged inline 6 engines. They also share the same exact bore, same stroke, the same 10.2:1 compression ratio. They're both aluminum blocks and aluminum cylinder heads. They share the same 7,000 red line. Again, very similar designs for these two engines. The N55 was primarily produced from 2011 to 2015. Whereas the N54 was 2007 to 2010, again, for the bulk of these engines. They did both continue on a little bit after that. The N54 was in that 1M in 2011 and was also in the Z4 35 IS up until 2016. And the N55 ran a little bit past 2015 when it was mostly phased out in favor of the BMW B58 engine. And the engines also both produce 300 horsepower and 300 torque in the bulk of models. There are some special cases, like with the N54, there was a 335 IS, as well as the BMW 1M that made roughly 335 horsepower and 330 torque. And same thing with the N55, there is a different variant that was actually in the M2 that's a little bit of a different engine, had a couple other tweaks, but also some examples of the N55 that make in that 335 horsepower ballpark. So again, a couple differences in power figures depending on the specific model, but for the most part, the bulk of these cars, looking at a standard 135, 335, 535i, so on, will make 300 horsepower, 300 torque. And a lot of similarities here, but jumping into a couple of the big differences between the N54 and N55, one of the most notable differences is the fact that the N54 utilizes a true twin turbocharged design, whereas the N55 uses a single twin scroll turbo. So basically it's just a single turbo with the turbo flange and the manifold split into two sections to better help those exhaust gases get into the turbocharger. And then also the N55 has Valvetronic, or variable valve lift. That is technology that the N54 did not receive, despite the N52 of the same era having the Valvetronic variable valve lift. So another difference between those engines there. And then lastly, this might open up a little bit of a can of worms here, because I know this is something that is pretty frequently debated and discussed in the BMW N54 and N55 communities, and that's the fact that the N54 has a forged crankshaft and forged rods, whereas the N54 only received forged rods. And a lot of people discuss what parts on these engines were forged, and some people say they didn't have forged rods. But indeed, pretty much any BMW built after 1980, maybe even a little bit before that, has forged rods, including the N54 and N55. So a big difference there is the N54 does have the forged crankshaft, whereas the N55 does not have the forged crankshaft, and they both have cast pistons. Moving on to another topic with the N54 versus N55, something that comes up frequently is reliability. Which engine is more reliable? Is one really more reliable than the other? And I will say the N55 does have the slight advantage when it comes to reliability. Now, don't get me wrong, neither of these engines are particularly reliable. However, the N54 was plagued with a couple more issues, especially in the earlier days, had endless high-pressure fuel pump problems. The fuel injectors were faulty. It took BMW up until the 12th iteration of the injectors to actually get it right. And the N54 runs into turbocharger and wastegate rattle issues more frequently than the N55. Outside of that, the two engines really suffer from a lot of the same reliability problems. The cooling system, including the water pump, electric cooling fan, coolant hoses, the expansion tank, all of that could be problematic. They both have similar oil leaks from the valve cover gasket, oil pan gasket, and oil filter housing gasket. Issues with Vanos solenoids, carbon buildup, cracked charge pipes, other boost leaks. So a lot of shared issues between these cars. I would say they're fairly close in reliability nowadays, assuming you find an N54 that has the newest iteration of the high pressure fuel pump, as well as Index 11 or Index 12 injectors. then they'll be on pretty similar grounds. Again, the N55 turbo is generally more reliable than the twin turbos on the N54, but slight advantage to the N55 overall. But again, don't buy either of these cars or engines anticipating a highly reliable vehicle. Some of it just comes down to the luck of the draw in terms of which one will be more reliable in the long term. But again, nothing necessarily great to say about reliability for either engine, except for the fact that the internals are pretty stout on both engines, and neither of them have very frequent internal engine issues, and that even holds true for some of these that are making 500-600 wheel horsepower. They still don't really run into too many internal problems unless you really start pushing the limit a lot further than that. Most of the mods and actual tuning on the N54 and N55 are going to be the same in terms of the basic bolt-on upgrades and larger upgrades like fueling mods and adding port injection, that kind of stuff. But the N54 is the more capable engine when it comes to modifying and tuning the engines. So on stock turbos, the N54 can see with full bolt-ons, tune, intake, downpipes, intercooler, and some E85 fueling, a low E85 mixture on the stock fuel system, or maybe kind of like a stage 1 fuel pump. You could see up to about 450 to 500 wheel horsepower with the N54. There are a couple differences with the actual power output of the N55 depending on whether it's EWG, electronic wastegates, or PWG, which is pneumatic or vacuum controlled wastegates. On the N55 PWG models, for the most part, with full bolt-ons on the stock turbocharger, they'll max out around 375 to 400 wheel horsepower. And then the EWG, which was mostly the 2014 plus N55, will max out around 400 to maybe 440 wheel horsepower. So a little bit of an advantage for the N54 there on stock turbos, or stock turbo in the case of the N55. The older N54 engine will produce about an extra 70 to 100 wheel horsepower. And that applies for turbo upgrades and bigger mods too. The N54 will have a much easier time getting to 600, 700, 800 wheel horsepower. In fact, I think the record for the N55 is somewhere in the mid 700s or low 800 wheel horsepower range, whereas there are a couple N54s that have made it to 1,000 wheel horsepower, and quite a few that have made it to that 750 to 800 wheel horsepower mark. So pretty big advantage for the N54 when it comes to tuning and modifying. And on top of that, both of these engines are fairly reliable internally. Don't really expect any issues on either one until at least 550 to 600 plus wheel horsepower. That assumes that you have a quality, proper tune and all of the proper supporting mods and bolt-ons to actually support that power, but not really any huge concerns until those power levels are really pushing much beyond that. However, the N55, one disadvantage is we have seen a lot more cases of rod bearing issues and failures on the N55 engine, which is obviously a pretty serious problem if you run into that. Now, it can and does happen to the N54 occasionally. It just seems more common on the N55, but still not something we would consider truly a common issue on either engine. So that wraps it up for mods and tuning. Again, N54, a little bit more capable. It has an easier time hitting certain power goals, and if you look at them mod for mod, upgrade for upgrade, the N54 is typically going to hold at least a 50 to 100 wheel horsepower advantage. And again, looking at the extreme ends, if you're really looking to push the limits, the N54 makes, an extra 200, 250 wheel horsepower over the N55. So as one final note, one benefit to the N55 here is certainly, and I think a lot of people would agree with this, one benefit of the N55 is sound. Having that single turbo, for whatever reason, really just sounds a lot better than the twin turbo setup on the N54. Now, that difference might not be so significant if you're planning on buying an N54 and throwing a big single turbo kit on it with a proper exhaust setup. Then they'll both sound pretty similar, but if you're talking about stock turbos or lighter modifications, we certainly think the N55 is the better sounding engine. Nothing against the N54, it's just the twin turbo setup. The exhaust note isn't necessarily the greatest. Ultimately, I think that about wraps it up for our N54 versus N55 comparison video. If you guys appreciated the content, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the description below for tons of awesome content on the N54 and N55. Thanks, guys.